Hi class, we're talking international trade today, and I want to start by making sure that we're clear on how economists view trade in terms of benefits and costs. Right? It's dangerous to say that all economists agree with a particular idea, but this is one where there's a lot of support and we get pretty close to consensus. Right? And that's this conclusion that international trade is a good thing. Countries, as a consequence, should put in place policies that encourage international trade, and we want to remove all the barriers to international trade. The logic to this, the reason why international trade is thought to be a good thing overall, is because it allows countries to focus on producing products that they're relatively good at, and then trade for things that they're not as good at producing. Right? So for us here in the United States, we would focus on producing those things that we're naturally good at. There's lots of other things that we could produce, but it would be very costly and time-consuming for us to do so. And so we're going to try to trade for those other products with countries who might be relatively good at making them. Right? So that's the idea. Everybody focuses just on producing those things that they're naturally good at producing, and then trades for the stuff that they could potentially produce, but would be very costly to do so. All right. That's sort of the logic. The formal economic idea that we're after here is something called comparative advantage. Right? And for the purposes of the problems you're going to encounter here, comparative advantage just means that you can produce something at a lower opportunity cost than can your trading partner. Remember, opportunity cost is the value of whatever you have to sacrifice whenever you pursue some course of an action. In the context of these problems, comparative advantage is the amount of one good that you give up when you decide to produce the other one. Right? This will, I think, become clearer once we put some numbers on the board. Right? So comparative advantage is a lower opportunity cost. That's the real important idea for explaining the gains from trade. Another important idea is something called absolute advantage. And that one's much more straightforward. This is just the ability to produce more of something than your trading partner. So if it's so that the United States can produce more wheat than can Mexico, it would be correct to say that the U.S. has an absolute advantage over Mexico in producing wheat. Right? Pretty easy. All right. Let's put some numbers here on the board so that we can see how comparative advantage is going to be used in practice. All right, so in the table here, I've got a couple of countries, and I'm setting up the problem so that they're producing two goods. So we have France and Italy, and I'm saying they're going to be producing olive oil and cheese. Right? The conclusion that I was talking about before is that these two countries are both going to be better off if they decide to specialize in producing one and then trade for the other one, as opposed to if they're each making a little bit of cheese and a little bit of olive oil. Right? And so the question then is who should make cheese and who should make olive oil? Right? You might have some ideas about that given the countries that we've set up here, but you want to verify that hypothesis with the actual numbers here. So let's go through and calculate comparative advantage for each. All right. The numbers in the box that you see here, these represent the maximum of each of these goods that the country can produce over a given period of time. So we're saying here that France can produce either 10 units of olive oil or alternatively 80 units of cheese. Each of those represent maximums. So that's 10 units of olive oil if they're going full speed ahead, producing olive oil, 100% of their productive resources being devoted to that good. And likewise for cheese. Italy, on the other hand, can at maximum make 50 units of olive oil or alternatively 100 units of cheese. Right? And so to figure out who should be making which good, we want to find the comparative advantage in the production of each. Who's got that comparative advantage in olive oil? Who's got the comparative advantage in the cheese? All right. And so to do that, we're just going to want to calculate opportunity costs for each country for each good. So let's start here by looking at our top row. We'll consider the case of France. Right? We want to identify the opportunity cost associated with producing olive oil. Right? In English, in plainer terms, what that's asking is every time they decide to make 1 unit of olive oil, how much cheese do they have to give up? Right? And we can see the ratio here in the table that we started with. Right? It's 10 units of olive oil for every 80 units of cheese, which implies for every 1 unit of olive oil that they would produce, they have to sacrifice 8 units of cheese. So the opportunity cost for France for 1 unit of olive oil would be 8. For France, the opportunity cost associated with cheese is going to be 1/8 of a unit of olive oil. And so you can determine that using the same process that we did a moment ago here by looking at the table. Alternatively, there's a trick you can use. You can just recognize that these opportunity costs are going to be the reciprocal of one another. Right? So if you feel comfortable about this opportunity cost of olive oil being 8/1, just flip that over and you'll get the opportunity cost of cheese being 1/8. Okay. Same thing for Italy. The opportunity cost for olive oil, what they give up every time they produce 1 unit of olive oil, is of course going to be 2 units of cheese, because 50 to 100 is as 1 is to 2. And using that reciprocal technique that we identified a second ago, you can see that the opportunity cost for cheese in Italy would be 1/2. All right. So these are the numbers here that we're going to use to figure out who's got the comparative advantage in the production of each good. Right? Don't forget, at the very outset, comparative advantage just means a lower opportunity cost. So when it comes to making olive oil here, we want to figure out who's got that lower number, right? 2 is lower than 8. We feel pretty good about that one. We don't even need a calculator to draw that conclusion. So if 2 is lower than 8, it means that Italy has a comparative advantage in making the olive oil. Right? When it comes to making the cheese, again, we want to compare these two numbers just like we did. We have 1/2 and 1/8. 1/8 is a smaller number than is 1/2. So France then has the comparative advantage in producing cheese. Right? And again, all this is telling us is that compared to one another, France is relatively good at making cheese, and Italy is relatively good at making the olive oil. And so to get those gains from trade, that's how they should specialize.